Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. Unfortunately, for many who profess to be Christians, idolatry is seen as a sin of the past. It was a sin practiced by Greek and Roman cultures and faded on into the background, confined to those other religions like Hinduism and Buddhism today. Well, I hate to break it to you. Adherents to Hinduism and Buddhism total about 1.7 billion people, just over 1/5 of the world's population, so it still exists today and is found within most countries. But even within so-called Christianity, we have the Catholic Marian devotions and statues of the apostles and pictures of Jesus present in their cathedrals, which scriptures clearly define as idolatry no matter how much they say it doesn't. You have the elevation of clergy above the lay people, which again is placing man in an elevated status that God didn't place him in, a form of idolatry. But even if you discount those, men and women worship money, possessions, and a whole host of things today, which, when you boil it all down, is simply idolatry in disguise. We're going to learn today that Christians are told to flee from idolatry, not to dabble in it or see how close we can get to it without sinning. So with that in mind, let's get to our study. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We're going to be reading from verses 14 to 22. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning at verse 14. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, though many, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. Observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What am I saying then? That an idol is anything? Or what is offered to idols is anything? Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? The question back in chapter 8 concerned eating meats offered to idols, specifically in the idol temple. Paul said that Christians have knowledge that the idol is nothing, and the meats offered to it are made no better or worse simply by being offered to the idol. So, there was nothing inherently sinful with eating those meats. However, that isn't the end of the story, for knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. A love for God and a love for neighbor. If I use my liberty and by using it I cause my brother to sin, then I have sinned against Christ. If I use my liberty and hinder the cause of Christ, then I have sinned against Christ. The liberty is still not sinful, however, the specific exercise in those situations was. So too was the arrogance that you could eat in the idol temple, place that temptation before you, and never sin by worshiping the idol. To him who thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken us that is not common to man. God provides a way of escape. It is our responsibility to take that way of escape and avoid sin. In the Corinthians case, even if they could eat meat in the idol temple without causing their brother to sin, even if they didn't hinder the cause of Christ, why were they intentionally placing temptation to worship the idol before them by choosing to eat in the idol temple? Yes, the idol temples were like restaurants today. But what else was going on there? Actual idolatry and other debaucheries like adultery, fornication, and prostitution. If you weren't going to the temple to teach against those things, then why on earth would you go? That is not the only place to eat meat, but even if it was, why subject yourself to guaranteed temptation? God's way of escape was to flee idolatry. Don't even dabble with it. Don't even see how close you can get to it without sinning. Run the other way. To further illustrate his point, Paul points them to the observance of the Lord's Supper. He said, the cup of blessing which we bless, which would be the fruit of the vine, is it not a communion of the blood of Christ? In other words, when we partake of the fruit of the vine, we are communing with one another, sharing with one another, and we are communing with Christ and the blood that he shed as the price for the forgiveness of sins. No, the fruit of the vine doesn't become the literal blood of Christ even though we can't perceive it. like the Catholics teach. But to say that Christ isn't spiritually present with us when we partake of the Lord's Supper, and to say that we aren't focusing on the blood that was shed on Calvary for us to take is to take the meaning out of the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is not a sacrament that provides grace. It is a memorial meal where we as Christians become one with Christ around the table. Likewise, when we partake of the bread, we are in communion with each other, with Christ, and with the body that hung on the cross as the sacrifice for sin. Again, the bread doesn't become the literal body of Christ like the Catholics teach, but we are in full communion with Christ, remembering his sacrifice when we partake of that one bread. And that's the point that Paul's getting across. We are many Christians, but when we, all Christians, partake of that one bread, we become one with Christ. Just in passing, this passage doesn't necessitate one loaf of bread and one cup, for as we discussed back in Luke 22, the disciples partook with multiple cups, but by partaking together, they became one with each other and with Christ. The same thing goes for the bread. Even Israel, when they brought sacrifices to the altar and ate of those sacrifices, they were partakers of the altar. They had fellowship with what was done on the altar. The type of sacrifice they brought was done in worship to God. Now, bring it to the meats offered at the idol temple. By saying what he said about the Lord's Supper and of Israel's sacrifices, is Paul saying that the idol is anything? That it has somehow been transformed into God simply because someone worships it? No. Is he saying that what is offered to the idol has now become anything? That it is somehow sanctified? Again, no. But the Gentiles believe that. What they're sacrificing to false gods and to demons and not to God. And so by eating in the idol temple, by eating the meat in the place where the offering was made, you are putting yourself in a situation where you're having fellowship with demons or becoming one with demons. That's certainly what the Gentiles think. For if you're eating where they sacrifice, why wouldn't they conclude that you approve? And what's more, eventually your conscience will become numb to the idolatry that you'll actually fall into the idolatry yourself. There are tons of Christians who believe that they can walk right up to the line of sin and not sin. And the first time that might be true, maybe even the second or the third. But will that always be true? From my experience watching people over the years, every time you come to see how close you can get to the line, it's that line slowly creeps further and further away until, lo and behold, you haven't noticed that what you've done is now not approaching sin, but is full-blown committing sin. Paul said that we cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons. If we think we can, are we really willing to provoke the Lord to jealousy? Do we think we are stronger than him? Look back at the Israelites. What happened to them when they sinned? God judged them and destroyed them. He will do the same to us as well. For the Corinthians, that meant don't eat meat in the idol temple, even though the idol was nothing and the meat was perfectly edible. For us, let us always consider how we practice our liberties, allowing love to edify us as to its proper use. Did Paul's discussion here mean that the Corinthians could never eat meat offered to idols, even at home? That's what we'll be discussing, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 23 to 33, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.